They say family should always have your back. But when my sister told me I'd die broke while flaunting her luxury apartment, I decided to teach her the ultimate lesson in karma. If you enjoy stories about sweet revenge, hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life drama. Growing up as the youngest of 3 children in a middle-class neighborhood in Boston, I always looked up to my older sister, Diane. She was everything I wasn't: confident, ambitious, and ruthlessly practical. While I pursued a degree in art history, Diane chose finance and climbed the corporate ladder with remarkable speed. By 30, she had a corner office at a prestigious investment firm, while I was still trying to find my footing after a series of gallery assistant jobs that barely paid the bills. Our relationship had always been complicated. Diane saw herself as my protector and advisor, but her guidance often came wrapped in criticism. "You need to be practical, Eloise," she'd say. "Your artistic dreams are lovely, but they won't pay your rent." I'd nod and smile, trying not to let her see how deeply her words cut. Our brother, Mark, stood somewhere in the middle, both geographically and temperamentally. He'd moved to Chicago after college and built a steady career as an engineer. He called on birthdays and holidays, visited twice a year, and generally stayed out of the silent competition that had defined Diane's and my relationship since childhood. Things came to a head 3 years ago at our parents' anniversary dinner. Diane had just closed on a stunning $1.4 million apartment in Tribeca, a sleek 2-bedroom with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the Manhattan skyline that made my modest Brooklyn studio feel like a shoebox. She couldn't stop talking about it, dropping the price tag into conversation every chance she got. "The property taxes alone are more than most people's rent," she said with a laugh that wasn't quite self-deprecating. "But it's an investment in my future. Property in Manhattan always appreciates." My father nodded approvingly while my mother made polite noises about the burden of such a large mortgage. Mark caught my eye across the table and gave me a subtle eye roll that made me feel slightly less alone. After dinner, as we helped Mom clear the table, Diane cornered me in the kitchen. "When are you going to get serious about your life, Eloise? You're 32 with nothing to show for it. No property, barely any savings. If you keep going like this, you'll die broke." The casual cruelty of her words stunned me into silence. Our mother, overhearing, scolded Diane half-heartedly before quickly changing the subject. But something shifted in me that night. It wasn't just that Diane had humiliated me in front of our family, it was the realization that she genuinely believed I was a failure. What Diane didn't know was that my career had recently taken an unexpected turn. 6 months earlier, I'd been approached by a tech startup looking for someone to curate their corporate art collection. The job combined my art expertise with the business acumen I'd picked up working in galleries. The salary was better than anything I'd ever made, and they'd offered me equity, a concept Diane would have appreciated if I'd bothered to tell her. But I hadn't told her, or anyone in my family except Mark, who had congratulated me sincerely and kept my secret. Years of having my career choices questioned had made me protective of my successes. And after that dinner, I decided to keep my new position to myself a little longer. Over the next 2 years, the startup thrived. As one of the early employees with equity, I watched my net worth grow in a way I'd never imagined possible. I moved from my Brooklyn studio to a comfortable 1-bedroom, but I didn't upgrade my lifestyle dramatically. I drove the same used Honda, wore the same mix of thrift store finds and sale items, and continued to listen to Diane's unsolicited financial advice whenever we met for our monthly coffee. "You should really think about investing," she'd say, stirring her latte. "Even with your limited income, you could be building something for the future." I'd nod and change the subject, secretly amused. My portfolio was being managed by one of the best financial advisors in the city, ironically, someone who had once worked with Diane before starting his own firm. "I'm actually thinking about taking a personal finance class," I told her once, just to see her reaction. Her face lit up with a mix of surprise and condescension. "That's a great idea, Eloise. It's never too late to learn the basics. I could recommend some books to get you started." I thanked her and tucked the list of recommended reading into my purse, where it joined several others from previous conversations. In reality, I'd already read most of the titles during my first month at the startup, when I realized I needed to understand how to manage my new financial situation. Then, last spring, something unexpected happened. Diane called me in tears, something I'd witnessed maybe twice in our adult lives. Her investment firm was downsizing after a merger, and she'd been let go with a severance package that, while generous, wouldn't sustain her lifestyle for long. The real estate market had taken a downturn, and she was worried about making her mortgage payments if she didn't find a comparable position quickly. "I've got interviews lined up," she said, her voice uncharacteristically small. "But nothing's guaranteed. The market's tight right now." I felt a complex mix of emotions, sympathy, of course, but also a tiny, shameful spark of satisfaction. The sister who had always positioned herself as my financial superior was suddenly vulnerable. I pushed that feeling aside and offered what help I could, which Diane politely declined. Her pride wouldn't allow her to accept assistance from her struggling little sister. As weeks turned into months, Diane's situation grew more precarious. The high-end job she'd expected to land quickly remained elusive. She'd had to dip into her savings, and I could see the stress etching lines around her eyes whenever we met. Still, she maintained the facade, arriving at our coffee dates in designer clothes and telling stories about exclusive events she'd attended, though I suspected some were from before her layoff. Mark called me after speaking with Diane. "She's in worse shape than she's letting on," he said quietly. "She asked if she could borrow money, Eloise. Diane asking for money. I helped what I could, but my kids' college funds come first." "Did you tell her about my job?" I asked. "Of course not. That's your news to share when you're ready." He paused. "But maybe it's time, sis. Not to gloat, but because she might actually take help from you if she knew." I considered his advice but wasn't ready yet. The wound from years of Diane's dismissal was still too fresh. Then came the call that changed everything. Diane's voice was tight, controlled. "I need to sell the apartment," she said without preamble. "The market's down, I'll take a loss. But I don't have a choice anymore." I felt a pang of genuine sadness for her. Despite our differences, I knew how much that apartment meant to her. It was the physical manifestation of her success, her security. "I'm so sorry," I said, meaning it. "Is there anything I can do to help?" There was a long pause. "Unless you've got $1 million hidden away somewhere, not really," she said with a brittle laugh. I took a deep breath. It was time. "Actually," I said carefully, "we should talk." We met at a quiet restaurant near Central Park, neutral territory. I arrived early and watched Diane walk in, her posture perfect as always, though I could see the tension in her shoulders. She ordered a glass of wine before even sitting down. "So," she said after taking a long sip, "what's this mysterious conversation we need to have? Have you finally decided to take my advice about going back to school for an MBA?" I shook my head and took out my phone, pulling up my banking app. Without saying anything, I turned the screen toward her, showing her my current net worth. Diane's eyes widened, and she actually gasped. "What am I looking at? Is this some kind of joke?" "No joke," I said, putting my phone away. "The startup I joined 3 years ago went public last quarter. My equity is now worth quite a bit." "But you never said anything?" she said, looking genuinely confused. "All this time when I was giving you financial advice. All this time when you were telling me I'd die broke," I corrected gently. Diane had the grace to look embarrassed. "I was trying to help you. I was worried about you." "No," I said, surprising myself with my calmness. "You were judging me based on what you thought success should look like. You never bothered to ask what I was actually doing with my life." She stared at her wine glass, uncharacteristically silent. "Anyway," I continued, "I hear you need to sell your apartment. I'm looking to invest in real estate. Maybe we can help each other." Diane's head snapped up. "You want to buy my apartment?" "I'm willing to pay market value," I said. "No discount, no favors. A straightforward business transaction between sisters." "But you hate Tribeca. You've always said it's pretentious." I smiled. "It's a good investment, and maybe I've changed my mind about the neighborhood." The truth was more complicated. Part of me genuinely wanted to help Diane out of a difficult situation. Another part the part I wasn't entirely proud of, wanted her to know what it felt like to have the tables turned. To have the sister she'd always looked down on become her financial savior. Diane stared at me for a long moment, her expression unreadable. Then she nodded slowly. I need to think about it. Of course, I said. Take your time. But she didn't need much time. The next morning, she called to accept my offer. The realtor says the market might get worse before it gets better, she explained, a hint of her old pragmatism returning. And I'd rather sell to family than a stranger. I suspect what she meant was that selling to me allowed her to maintain some dignity. She could tell our parents and friends that she'd chosen to downsize, that she was helping her sister upgrade. It was a narrative that preserved her pride. Over the next few weeks, we worked out the details. I secured financing, though I could have paid cash, and we set a closing date. Throughout the process, Diane was subdued, almost shell-shocked. When she handed me the keys at closing, her eyes were bright with unshed tears. I can stay until the end of the month, right? Like we discussed? She asked. Of course, I assured her. Take the time you need. What I didn't tell her was that I'd already found her a new apartment. A lovely, if modest, one-bedroom in a safe neighborhood with good public transportation. I'd paid the security deposit and first 3 months' rent as a gift. It was my way of extending an olive branch, of showing that despite everything, I did care about her well-being. The day after closing, I visited my new property. Diane was out at a job interview, and I wanted to get a feel for the space without her hovering presence. The apartment was just as beautiful as I remembered. Spacious, filled with light, with the kind of architectural details that whispered luxury at every turn. As I wandered from room to room, I noticed small things that spoke of Diane's distress. A half-packed box here, a stack of financial documents there. In her home office, her normally immaculate desk was cluttered with job rejection letters and past due notices. My heart squeezed at this evidence of my sister's struggle. Then I saw it, a framed photo I'd never noticed before. It was Diane and me as children, maybe 8 and 5, holding hands at the beach. We were both laughing, sand-covered and happy, uncomplicated by the competitive dynamics that would later define our relationship. I picked it up, studying our innocent faces, and something resolved within me. I called my contractor on the spot and arranged for a set of new locks to be installed. Not the next week as originally planned, but that very afternoon. Then I texted Diane, asking when she'd be home. We needed to talk. When she arrived, her face was drawn with disappointment from another unsuccessful interview. She barely looked at me as she dropped her keys on the entryway table. Diane, I said quietly, I've found you a new place to live. She looked up, confused. What do you mean? I explained about the apartment, the paid deposit, the timeline. As I spoke, her expression shifted from confusion to disbelief, to something that looked almost like hurt. So you're kicking me out? After everything? She asked. No, I said firmly. I'm helping you start fresh, without the financial pressure of this place. The new apartment is yours for as long as you need it. No rent for 3 months while you find your footing. And what will you do with this place? Rent it out? Sell it when the market improves? There was a bitterness in her voice that made me sad. Actually, I said, I'm going to live here. Diane stared at me. You're moving in? I nodded. It's time for a change. And this place? It has good bones. I think I can be happy here. What I didn't say was that I also saw it as a chance to redefine our relationship. By living in the space that had been the symbol of her success and my failure, maybe I could finally exorcise the ghost of our old dynamic. I've had the locks changed, I added gently. I'll help you move your things this weekend. Diane sank into a chair, looking suddenly small. You changed the locks, she repeated. You really are taking it all away from me. No, I said, sitting across from her. I'm not taking anything that wasn't freely sold. And I'm giving you something in return, a chance to rebuild without the pressure of keeping up appearances. We sat in silence for a long moment. Then, to my surprise, Diane began to laugh. A small, broken sound at first, then fuller. It's kind of perfect, isn't it? The ultimate role reversal. You buying my apartment and changing the locks? Very symbolic. I smiled cautiously. I prefer to think of it as a fresh start for both of us. Diane wiped her eyes, which were shining with what might have been tears, or might have been the reflection of the afternoon sun. You know, when we were kids, Mom always said you were the kind one. I never really saw it until now. The words caught me off guard. Diane had never been one for sentimentality or compliments. I don't know about that, I said. This isn't entirely selfless. No, she agreed. But it's more generous than I deserve after how I've treated you. She looked around the apartment. Her apartment, now my apartment, with a strange mix of nostalgia and resignation. I guess we should start packing. Over the next week, I helped Diane move into her new apartment. It was a strange, emotionally complicated process. Each box we packed represented not just her possessions, but the dismantling of her carefully constructed identity. Yet, as her old apartment emptied, I noticed something unexpected. Diane seemed lighter, as if shedding the trappings of her former life was liberating in a way neither of us had anticipated. I don't think I need to take the dining table, she said on our second day of packing. It's too big for the new place, and honestly, I only bought it because the interior designer said it was perfect for entertaining. I've had exactly 2 dinner parties in 5 years. Are you sure? I asked. We could make it fit. Diane shook her head. No, I think I'd like something different. Something I choose because I actually like it, not because it makes the right statement. It was the first of many such moments. Diane letting go of furniture, artwork, even clothing that had been more about projecting an image than reflecting her true self. By the time we were ready to move her essential items to the new place, we donated 3 carloads of possessions to various charities. The new apartment, though modest by her previous standards, was charming in its own right. Hardwood floors, large windows, a renovated kitchen with plenty of counter space. As we arranged her furniture and hung her art, the space began to feel like home. It's not so bad, is it? I asked as we collapsed on her couch after a long day of moving. Diane looked around, her expression thoughtful. It's different. But no, it's not bad. She hesitated, then added, Thank you, Eloise. I know I don't deserve your help after how I've treated you. That's what family does, I said simply. We help each other, even when it's complicated. Still, she insisted, most people in your position would have enjoyed watching me struggle a bit more. Lord knows I've given you reason. I thought about that night at our parents' house, the casual cruelty of her words. Maybe I wanted to prove something, I admitted, to show you that success doesn't have to look the way you think it should. Diane nodded slowly. Message received. Loud and clear. She reached for her purse and pulled out a small notebook. I found this while packing. It's from when we were in high school. She handed it to me, and I recognized it immediately. A journal I'd kept during my sophomore year, filled with sketches and notes about art history. I'd thought it lost decades ago. I borrowed it, Diane said, looking slightly embarrassed. I was curious about what you were always writing. I meant to give it back, but then, I don't know. I kept it. I flipped through the pages, surprised by how familiar it all felt. My teenage handwriting, my earnest observations about Renaissance painters, my dreams of working in a museum someday. You were so passionate, Diane said quietly. Even then, you knew exactly what you loved. I envied that. I just knew I wanted security, success. But the actual work? I could have been doing anything as long as it paid well and impressed people. Her confession stunned me. I'd spent so many years assuming Diane looked down on my career choices, never considering she might have envied my clarity of purpose. You never said anything, I murmured. Neither did you about your job at the startup, she pointed out with a wry smile. I guess we're both good at keeping secrets. In the months that followed, we both adjusted to our new realities. I moved into the Tribeca apartment but made it my own, replacing Diane's sleek, impersonal decor with colorful art and comfortable furniture. The space that had once intimidated me became a home I loved. Diane, meanwhile, found a job at a smaller firm, less prestigious than her previous position, but with a work culture she actually enjoyed. She started dating someone she met at a neighborhood coffee shop, a kind-hearted teacher who couldn't have cared less about designer labels or status symbols. He asked me what I did for a living, and when I told him I was between jobs, he just nodded and asked what I liked to read, she told me over brunch one Sunday. No judgment, no awkward change of subject. It was refreshing. Our relationship evolved too. Without the financial power imbalance that had defined it for so long, we discovered we actually enjoyed each other's company. Our conversations no longer revolved around career advice or thinly veiled competitions, but instead focused on books we'd read, places we wanted to travel, the everyday joys and challenges of our lives. When our parents visited New York, they commented on the change. "You two haven't bickered once this entire weekend," our mother observed with a mixture of suspicion and delight. "What's happened?" Diane and I exchanged a glance. "We've reached an understanding," Diane said simply. "About time," our father grumbled, though I caught the pleased smile he tried to hide behind his newspaper. Mark noticed too, during his summer visit. "Whatever voodoo you worked on, Diane, it's impressive," he said as we walked through Central Park. She actually asked me about my kids without immediately segueing into a lecture about college savings plans. I laughed. No voodoo, just a change in perspective for both of us. One evening, about a year after the move, Diane invited me to dinner at her apartment. She'd become quite the cook, another unexpected development in her new life. As we sat at her small dining table, enjoying a meal she'd prepared, she raised her glass in a toast. "To new beginnings," she said, her eyes meeting mine. "And to sisters who know when to change the locks." I laughed and clinked my glass against hers. "To new beginnings," I echoed. Later, as I was leaving, Diane handed me a small, wrapped package. "Just a little housewarming gift," she said. "Better late than never." When I opened it at home, I found the framed beach photo I'd discovered in her office that day. The one of us as children, happy and uncomplicated. I placed it on my mantel, a reminder of what we'd lost and found again. Sometimes, when friends visit my apartment and hear the story of how I acquired it, they expect a tale of triumph and revenge. They're surprised when I tell them it's actually a story about reconciliation. Yes, I bought my sister's $1.4 million apartment and changed the locks. But what I really did was break the lock on a toxic pattern that had trapped us both. Diane no longer tells me I'll die broke. Instead, she asks about my latest art acquisition or shares articles about financial planning that might interest me. I no longer hide my successes from her, but celebrate them openly, just as I celebrate hers. The irony isn't lost on either of us, that it took a complete reversal of our financial situations to restore the sisterhood we'd lost somewhere between childhood and adulthood. Money, which had been the wedge driving us apart for so long, became the unexpected bridge that brought us back together. The apartment that once symbolized everything wrong with our relationship has become the place where we rebuild it. One dinner, one conversation, one shared memory at a time. And that, I've discovered, is worth far more than $1.4 million. Last week, Diane came over with a bottle of wine and news. She'd been offered a partnership at her firm. As we celebrated on my balcony, overlooking the city lights, she turned to me with an expression I'd never seen before, one of genuine admiration. "You know," she said, "I think you might have been the smart one all along." I smiled and shook my head. "Not smart, just following a different path." She nodded, understanding at last. "Different paths," she agreed. "But somehow, we ended up in the same place anyway." And as we stood there, the Manhattan skyline glittering before us, I realized she was right. After all our years of competition and misunderstanding, we'd finally arrived at the same destination, a place of mutual respect, genuine affection, and the knowledge that true wealth has very little to do with money.